So, hello and welcome to everybody. My guest tonight is Jim Crosby, who some of you may know, some of you may not. But for those of you that don't know him, Jim is probably the person, as far as pioneers go, which is what this series is all about, is probably the person who has pioneered the investigation of dog bites. Probably knows more about fatal dog bites than anybody else in the world. In fact, I'm sure he does. But as I've got to know him, so I've learned there's so much more to him than just fatal dog bites. So we're not going to be talking just about dogs that kill people, although I must admit it is something I find a bit fascinating, and that's probably my darker gothic side coming through. But Jim is a
You weren't a
psychologist.
policeman in the back. You sure you weren't a police officer in your former life someplace?
I don't know. I haven't a clue what I was in a former life. But anyway, a little bit about Jim. He's a psychology graduate, and he's now a retired policeman. And or police, I think you say in America, as I've learned from watching The Wire. I've started watching this TV series, The Wire. I don't know if you've seen that. Have
Yes, that's not quite as much fun as or we don't have that much fun.
Okay, but it's good. I like it. But we maybe talk about that later on. And you're currently doing your PhD in veterinary forensics, which is all about your dog bite stuff anyway, and we'll get to chat about that as well. So welcome, Jim. Lovely to see you again. And
great to see you again, Daniel, and it's wonderful to be on your podcast with you. And hello to all the wonderful people there in the UK that I miss horribly, but unfortunately your fine island is not letting us in these days, which is probably a smart thing.
Yeah, I don't know. I think we've both got our problems, but we'll steer clear of the politics.
Yes.
So these are going to be time immemorial and completely independent of that. And I can see you've got a beautiful sunny day, and people can see that I'm in the dark. I'm in my office at home. It's evening here, but it's a beautiful sunny day in Florida by the looks of things. So welcome, and thank you once again for giving up the time to chat to me. There's so much to chat to you. We'll see where we end up. As I said, I got to know you about your work really because of the fatal dog bite stuff, and somewhere around here, here, I've got the dog bite book that Zoom kindly goes and reverses.
Mine's over here.
I think you're the only person who's got 2 chapters in this, actually. So you did 2 chapters for us, and people want to read about some of your work, you should be warned there are some gruesome pictures in there in the whole book, and there are some in your chapter as well. So anyway, but how did you, so let's start with the obvious question. How did you end up getting dragged into fatal dog bites, and why didn't you run in the opposite direction? Or is that safe? Is that a safe area to work in if you're American?
Oh, sure. As the Grateful Dead once said, it's been a long, strange trip. It goes back to my evil background as a police officer. To kind of do the quick catch up, I spent 22 and a half years on the police force here in Jacksonville, Florida. I retired as what you would call a lieutenant. We call it a lieutenant, but a lieutenant. I love that. But I retired that, and a few years before I retired, I have a wife and 2 daughters, and I decided I wanted another testosterone-producing buddy in the house. So I got a curly-coated retriever by the name of Sam. And it's Sam's fault that I got down all of these weird paths, because I got him and then decided to learn to actually train him. I'd been around the police canines. I was never assigned to them, but I'd been in dogs forever, so I'd been around them for a long, long time. And so first I started with basic training, and then I started competing, and then we started doing field events, like the retriever competitions you have over there, where the dogs compete against each other. And after getting into and learning more and more about training and dog behavior and the essence of what canines are, beyond what I knew as just a pet owner. And about in 2001, out in San Francisco, there was a famous attack on a poor woman by the name of Diane Whipple, where two very large dogs, Presa Canarios, were set upon this poor woman, and they killed her. And at that point, I had retired about 2 years before. And although I'd been paying attention to dogs all this time, the old cop in me surfaced and popped up and said, how could a relationship between a human and a dog go so badly that the dogs actually killed a human? And as a result of that, I started looking into it. I mean, sadly, we kill dogs all the time. We're a horrible, we are the only inherently vicious breed that I'm aware of.
We also kill each other a lot, I think.
we do plenty of damage, but I started wondering about it. And at that point I started reading, and I wound up actually meeting and becoming friends with Randall Lockwood, who at that point was with HSUS and then went to the ASPCA. I finally, over the years, met Jeffrey Sachs. They were the two that had written some of the earliest fatal dog attack papers here in the U.S. Dr. Lockwood was actually involved in the Whipple case. So I started looking and realizing that although people like Randy and Dr. Sachs had looked at the cases from an academic point, where they reviewed media reports and looked at a few police reports, nobody had really looked at these cases across the board with the eyes of a cop, with evidence in mind, and looking not only what happened, but why. And one of the things I found was that most police departments at the time, and it was just pretty much the same in the UK, police would walk in, you have a body, you have a dog, you have the body that looks like it's been bitten by the dog. Okay, here what happened is they shot the dog, they loaded the body up into the meat wagon, and everybody went home. To me, coming from my bizarre mindset, this is a homicide and deserved the investigation that any homicide deserved. And I started pulling and asking why. And that started to tumble over time. And as a result, in the years since, I've actually been feet on the ground on the scene of more fatal dog attacks on humans than anybody else I've ever heard of.
I think that's a fair summary. It's an interesting claim to the Guinness Book of Records, but
yeah, I tell people I have not spoken to Guinness, and I don't think that's something we should try to do. But I've actually been directly on scene in almost 50 cases, and by on scene I mean go to the crime scene, talk with the officers, put hands on the dogs that have not been killed before I get there, do behavior evaluations, stand with the medical examiner during autopsy and observing the injuries to the humans, up close and personal, physically talking to witnesses, talking to surviving victims in some cases.
So that's one thing which, because in preparation for tonight, I did have a quick reread of the 2 chapters. And in the first chapter, it's one of the first things you actually say is pretty much what you've just said. You'd arrive on a scene, there's a dog, there's a dead person, kill the dog, boom, crime solved, etc. And I'd like to chat to you about some of those crimes, because they weren't the dog in some instances, it seems. We'll come to those. But you also make the really important point here that if we treat it like that, then actually we learn nothing about prevention. And that's a problem that we have in the UK as well, that exactly the same attitude tends to be adopted. And I'm not saying that we should be keeping every dog alive, and in any situation. But we need to perhaps keep them alive for long enough so that we can learn what lessons can be learned in order to try and prevent it in future. And that's something which I just don't think, for whatever reason, and maybe it's the cost of things, I don't know, but people are not investing in that. And I think that's a great shame. And it's taken a pioneer like yourself to really start to put this on the map and on the global map. I know you've been in the UK training British police about this, but I still don't see that happening very much.
It doesn't happen much. I've been very fortunate. The 2 trips I made to the UK, I can talk about one of them a little bit now. At the time, we were kind of running under the radar. You had a fatality with multiple dogs involved it wasn't in London, but it was in the southern UK. And
it's a small country. It's just the UK for you. It's okay.
It's the UK. But in any case, these multiple dogs had taken the life of a person. And the dogs were being held in one of the unspecified location secret kennels that the Met and other groups tend to have scattered about the country. And because of my evil police background and talking to some people and doing the training I was doing, I worked with the status dog unit there with the Met in London, great bunch of guys. They snuck me into one of the secret UFO locations, and I had the ability to actually put hands on and do evaluations because they had seized the 5 dogs and were in the process of the court issues. And so I was able to evaluate those dogs and I think I have a very good idea of what precipitated that particular attack. But that was kind of the first time that I think that pretty much happened in the UK. My next trip back, I had the opportunity to go to West Mercia, where a woman was attacked and nearly killed. One of the dogs perished on scene. It was blamed on the police, but we were able to go to Hawkshead to the necropsy facility there at the Royal Veterinary College and prove it wasn't. But the other dog I was able to evaluate also. So we've gotten a little bit of that information out there. I think part of the problem is, though, there are not that many people who are crazy enough to want to put hands on the dogs. There were evaluations done, for instance, in this country before I came along, where, for instance, in the Whipple case, one of the 2 dogs was killed before evaluation, but the other dog, the Pressa, they had a handler in a full protective bite suit in a fenced area with the behavior experts that were involved, both of whom were friends, watching through the fence. But before that, before I came along, really, nobody had actually put hands on the dogs. And I personally, it's understand, and I give the warning all the time. The idea in the investigation is not to prove that you could handle the biggest badass dog in the world. That's not it.
Right.
And scars and bite marks are not medals. They're evidence that you screwed up. They are mistakes. But I really feel, the way I go through evaluations, there are triggers and diagnostic things that I can get from a live dog that I can't get from a dead dog. There's still, with a dead dog, there's still physical evidence we want to process. Everything from DNA to blood smears to stomach contents to full body radiographs to find out if there was a painful condition that might have contributed to the incident. There's a lot of stuff. And if someone picks up the investigation chapter in the book, you can see just how far I go into this sometimes. But yes, it goes back to the fact that, number one, there aren't a lot of people who are willing to deal with these dogs. Number two, there's a bunch of them who are willing. We probably shouldn't be letting play with the dogs or anything sharper than a crayon. And there's also the court system. Fortunately, over time, I've been able to work in where the courts, including the Crown Court in both in the UK and Canada and Australia, have made exceptions to the normal rule because they understand from my history, like I put it one time, I'm not here to save the dog. I'm here to find out what happened. Frankly, dogs that kill people, I have a real, except in very rare circumstances, I have a real problem putting them back out on the street. So just because the people who would want them are not people we want having those dogs.
So of the cases you've investigated, I mean, in what proportion of instances, because one of my friends is a forensic psychologist, and he said, you know, the difference between murder and GBH is usually an inch. You got stabbed and it just happened to get your heart. And I just wonder, in the case of dogs, what proportion of cases do you think are accidental and they've bitten, they've hit a major blood vessel? I mean, do they go on, or do they represent a sizable proportion, or do you?
They're not a sizable proportion, I don't think. They do happen, and that's one of the things I'm doing with my dissertation right now is based on the injuries and examining the evidence, I believe I've been able to break up serious, and you know, sometimes a fatality depends strictly on how close you happen to live to a hospital. So, but serious bites and fatal bites, I believe I've been able to break them based on the evidence and how the evidence reflects the behavior into a group of categories where we can look at them and actually learn the different contributing factors with some of these categories. One of them is what I'm calling accidental. And that is a bite that normally would not be particularly serious. If you're familiar with your countryman Ian Dunbar's bite scale, scale, we're talking about level 3 and some low level 3.
Just for the benefit of people listening, I'll put links onto the Facebook site, What Makes You Click, to both the Randy Lockwood and the Sachs papers, but also and if people see me looking away, it's because I'm making notes of things I have to do. And I'll also put a link to Ian Dunbar's bite scale. Ian did an earlier podcast, so yeah.
So haven't talked to him in a while, but I love Ian.
He's in good form, I can tell you.
Good.
He's coping with lockdown very well.
But in any case, and I'll give you 2 quick examples. In one case out in the Pacific Northwest, a gentleman was walked up to a truck, and there was a dog, a large hound dog, and he put his hand out for the dog to sniff it, and the dog nipped his finger. Minor, ooh, sorry, ouch, no big deal. But and I can never remember the name, the canophagous bacteria that all dogs have in their mouth, this poor gentleman was immunocompromised from having a splenectomy years before. And the bacteria went septic because he didn't do anything, because it wasn't serious. And he horribly died 5 days later. Another, even more to the point, this case happened in South Florida. I've met the parents and talked to them, and they've done a lot with educating about children and dogs. But Liam Perk, who was 2 years old at the time, was being carried out of one room in the house to the other by his father, Joey. And they had a 12-year-old Weimaraner who was being grumpy for the day. He was just in a bad, he was old, he was cranky, he was being grumpy. And as Joey was walking by the dog with Liam in his arm, Joey doesn't know whether he bumped the dog, accidentally stepped on his tail, or what. The dog had been facing away, and the dog flipped around very quickly and gave a very quick, what I would call an engage and release. Single bite, moderated, controlled, but the closest place to the dog on the collective child-adult target was right on the carotid artery of the child. And poor Liam bled out from a very minor single puncture level 3 bite before EMS could get to him. There was nothing his father could do. It was a freak accident. And to me, the profile of that is horribly and terribly different than a dog that has 2 dogs I had out in the far western U.S. that chased down a man, took him to the ground, and ripped him to shreds. 2 different profiles, which is different from a dog that perhaps was being defensive and was protecting, at least I think in the dog's mind, his owner, but disproportionately so.
So what do you think? What do you think was going on in the mind of those dogs that was chasing people down, especially when they're chasing adults down? Do you think it's predatory, or?
I'm calling it offensive aggression, and it verges. I think we have to draw, for practical purposes, we need to draw a line between severe offensive and actual predatory behavior. So in my mind, I consider predatory to be when, for instance, I had dogs that chased a child down a road, dragged it back to the child back to their property, and then consumed much of the musculature on the child's upper body and actually ate it. Or an elderly gentleman that, again, 2 dogs took down, they drug him, and then they consumed. And in both of those cases, although they weren't starving dogs, there were nutritional factors involved. The two dogs that took down the old gentleman, they had been scrounging in garbage cans for food for weeks. The group that took down the child, it was 6 of them, and they were all not emaciated, but substandard body condition. So in both of those, there were some nutritional factors. Mm-hmm. There was a study done in Canada back in the late 70s on one case where some campers were actually set upon and eaten by domestic dogs. You might have read about it.
That's actually in the book. That's right. Somebody else wrote about that. I think rather than you.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, that was not mine. I have seen in the almost 50 cases I've been on scene, I've seen, I think, 3 or 4 that I would honestly classify as predatory.
Even that includes the babies, you think? Most of the babies?
Yeah, even including babies. A lot of the ones with babies, they're kind of an attack on their own, because most of the baby cases you find, the dog comes over that's not been supervised with the child and pokes or picks up the child, and the child makes a noise. So Fluffy the dog picks up the child and goes and shakes the child. And typically cause of death in those is a cervical fracture between C2 and C3, so just below the atlas, where it severs the spine. Or there are compression injuries to the very young child's head that causes cranial fractures and hematomas and death from that.
So this is getting really dark, but we're gonna have to lighten it up soon. But in the book, the person who wrote about a lot of the child injuries, I mean, he drew a lot of attention to the head crush injuries.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think a dog would go for a child's head, though? You know,
it's an easy target. It's sticking up. It kind of looks like a ball.
So that's interesting, because I know in Germany there was a thing about you shouldn't play with a ball with your dog because it could lead to that sort of attack. And you know,
I can see that.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, if a child's been, whether a child's on the floor or been laying on a couch or put in a baby seat, that little head is sticking up, and it's a great knob to grab at. And you know, I think that in some of these cases, the dogs go, you know, there's a small child and it may be making noises and it smells funny. So the dog picks it up and the child yells or cries, "Oh, it's a squeaky toy. It's making noise." So they crunch down a little bit harder and shake it, and then the child stops making noise. And then they put the child down going, "This is a stupid toy. It doesn't make any noise anymore." And very often in those cases, the dog's post-attack, which is something else I'm looking at, is behavior post-attack. The dogs they're almost, "What? I grabbed the toy. Why is everybody so excited?" You know.
So I'm going to pick up on one of the other things before we move on, because as I said, I'm just thinking, because I actually posted on the Facebook site and said, do people still want me to carry on with the podcasts as well as the YouTube videos? And a few people said, yeah, we like the podcast because we listen to them on the way to work in the morning or in the gym. And I'm thinking, oh God, I wonder what these people are thinking of this morning. Welcome to your morning. Here we go.
Especially if you're on the motorway and go up to a toll booth where there's somebody who's hearing the podcast through the open window and saying, well, when they grab the baby and...
So you mentioned offensive aggression. I think I think it's really interesting, because there's been a growing opinion and sort of for a number of years, and it just went too far, where people say, dogs only ever bite out of defense, and you're thinking, no. And yes, you know, probably the vast majority of dogs are biting when they're cornered and they can't escape, but there are offensive dogs that go for it. What do you reckon's going on in those dogs' minds then?
I think that these are dogs that, I think when we break it down, we have to look at what the purpose. I don't like the word intent, because I think that's imputing too much humanality, even though, again, with your work, we've got emotions going on behind the scene anyway. But I like to call it the purpose. And what's the purpose of the actual engagement? Is this a dog that is fearful and trying to gain space, or is this a dog that is trying to use offensive behavior to protect resources or to protect territory? Is this a dog that is, because of the way they're wired, or perhaps some emotional background, is this a dog that has strong prey drive or chase drive, or whatever we want to use for it this week, that is triggered and then has, because of whatever reasons, and there are many, we could go on for hours, but they engage deliberately.
Those sorts of scenarios are what I would tend to refer to as amongst the range that relate to frustration. If you're protecting your territory or protecting a resource, you're trying to stop something being taken away from you. And the whole emotion of frustration is about autonomy, having control over the situation. And I really like the fact that you just now said, I don't want to say intent. Actually, just before I called you up for this chat, I was working on a lecture, and you know, human minds have only probably been able to think in terms of causes for less than 100,000 years.
Oh, easy.
You know, within that time frame, we went from being, you know, hunting what happened to be around to actually starting to be able to plan, you know, our hunting. And actually, the really big sort of bit of planning probably has only happened in the last less than 20,000 years, which is round about the time we've had dogs, coincidentally, which I think is a really fascinating topic. But but to us, it is so intuitive to always ascribe a cause, that you do it for a reason. And we talk about, you know, you can have outcome focused activity, but, you know, animals other than humans, if they've got consciousness, it's a stream of consciousness. And there's a really nice analogy that's, I think it's Daniel Dennett that said it, that, you know, probably the sort of consciousness, he calls it a stream of consciousness. If you're driving to work and you're going to a regular workplace, it's not that you're unconscious, but you can't remember anything about the journey if nothing.
You're on autopilot.
Happens. And you were conscious the whole time, you know, you certainly weren't under the influence. I hope you weren't under the influence, especially being a policeman. But and it's that sort of living in the here and now very much. And so if something happens, it happens. And that is probably I think, to me, I find that perhaps the best description of the sort of consciousness that cats, dogs, and horses probably live in. It's not that they're unconscious, but it's very much here and now. You know, we worry about, can you pay the mortgage? The dog worries about the fact that a piece of food has fallen out of his bowl, and, oh, have I got to wait for it, or can I go and grab that bit while you tell me? I'll wait for you to say I can eat the main food. You know, it's it's so difficult to divorce that out.
And I agree with you. And in fact, based on when I first met you and talking about frustration and looking into some of those the emotional work that's going on that you and your team are doing along with others, I think that is probably a good useful label to be able to put, whether you know, whether you want to call it frustration or whether you want to call it, you know, I use the term offensive aggression as opposed to defensive, but in very much the same way, when I talk to people about dog bites, I don't, again, want to put intent, because I think that has too much baggage. But in my mind, and from what I've seen with all these dogs, when a dog bites, and whether he's planning 6 weeks out or 6 seconds out, to me, there's a purpose. In other words, a dog bites for a reason. Something in the situation, in the moment, in the environment makes sense to the dog that an appropriate response involves using teeth.
Yeah.
And from what I've seen in the evaluations, you know, people go on with this, oh, my dog just snapped. No, he didn't just snap. You're not paying attention. Now, there are a few dogs I've seen that have abbreviated or limited signaling ability. But every time I've been able to watch my own videos and watch the dogs and so forth, dogs tend to, unless, and I do believe there are a few Jeffrey Dahmer and Ted Bundy mentally ill dogs out there, probably a smaller percentage than there are of humans, but there's signaling. It happens very quickly. I do think sometimes dogs consider us to be their slow relatives because they're talking to us quite well and we're not picking up on the cues.
That's a really neat point. Yeah, I think that, and it's a video that I show the students, the number of signals that, you know, two dogs, unfamiliar dogs meet and whatever, and we talk about the signals that they use in order to establish who's going to take precedence, who's going to lead in the game, things like that. and it's literally about 2 or 3 seconds long. And I said, did you
Mm-hmm.
see the, you know, the 10 signals there? And the students were, what? Okay, let's watch it in slow motion now.
Right.
And you can see this whole switch going on of the different expressions and postures, and they've established what is going on. And yeah, who is going to take precedence there?
Yeah, and that's one of the things, not to totally get sideways, but that's one of the things that I dislike about and don't trust about using the fake dog or the fake doll.
Oh, we're going to come to that. We're going to come to that.
We'll come to that.
Because I know you gave a talk at the recent ABS meeting, and I think we're probably on the same chord. But before we leave this, because
right.
one of the things which, you know, you say you use offensive, defensive, and I might talk about fear and frustration. To me, that they are different. And when I talk about behavioral evaluations, I say there are 3 elements to a behavioral evaluation or diagnosis in my context. You know, I use the word diagnosis, and I have conversations with a number of colleagues, and they sort of quite rightly say, well, should we call it a diagnosis when we're talking about
I do the same thing. I look at it as a diagnosis.
I call it a diagnosis because it's a short word, and I'm a vet, so it's easy for me. But I say there are 3 elements to it. There is the context, you know, and that is the circumstances, and that's very much the immediate triggers of the situation that you just talked about. There is the motivation. What does the animal want out of it? Okay, so that's whether it's protecting resources or trying to drive somebody away. And then there is the emotion, and the emotion is how, not what the animal wants, but how the animal feels, if you like, about the situation. And emotions are there to set strategies. You think about behavioral motivation, what is the particular goal? But the emotion is sort of, what is your global mindset at this moment for you personally? And emotions are what allow us, you know, that I like chocolate, you may like chocolate, but you probably don't like it as much as I do. You know, that sort of, that difference, that's what makes us individuals, that we can value things. And so there's that difference between emotion and motivation. And it's something which I think gets very confused in our field, that people, I mean, and I've heard people talk about emotivation because they're saying, oh, well, the 2 are bound up. Well, no, they're not actually. Emotion is all about the individualization of the world around you. Motivation is about the broad biological goals of what you want to achieve. And I think since using this approach, things just make so much more sense, but you've got to keep stopping yourself from slipping into, well, yeah, the terminology and certainly the terminology that implies that the animal has thought about it in great length beforehand, and, you know, Machiavellian planning and thinking, you know what, I really sort of, I've decided that on Tuesday I'm going to go for you. That said, and actually this is an interesting one, and I said we would move on, but I just want to go back. Maybe not fatal, but anecdotally, and I'm just interested in your opinion on this, have you seen cases, whether they be fatal or not, where clearly the owner and the dog have not a great relationship? The owner stumbles or puts himself in some other disadvantage and the dog goes for it. Have you seen that sort of scenario? Because I've seen a few, and, you know, the dog might be really obedient because it's been punished like nobody's business. And then the person slips and falls down the stairs, and the dog, you know, who's never shown any overt aggression towards the owner that they have any recollection for, really seems to go for it. Have you ever seen cases like that?
A couple.
Yeah.
And
rare.
like I said, like you said, I don't believe it's a Machiavellian kind of thing. And it's like when we have the those who shall not be named in this country, who are big into the dominance theories. Your dogs aren't sitting there at night going, all right, Tuesday, if dad shows any weakness, we're taking the refrigerator. You know, that I don't believe is going on, but that's one of the things I've been fascinated about once we connected and I started looking into the work with the emotions, is that I think that especially in those cases where we have a difference between a warning attack or a fairly moderated bite versus my worst case scenarios, I'm really starting to suspect that if we're able to break it down, there are not only functional differences, but there are going to be emotional differences. And I'm toying with the idea that even the post-attack evaluations, by watching some of the stuff that you and your folks are doing with micro expressions and other things, that we might be able to drill down and find out more about the difference in the emotional horsepower, backing, whatever term we want to use, in a dog that actually continues an attack beyond
Yeah.
basic things, and how those dogs are wired different, because they are. Again, we have the accidentals, but some of them are wired differently.
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting thought, the idea of looking after the attack. And I don't think anybody has done anything on that. And you mentioned the micro expressions, and again, for the people who don't know what that is, one of the things we've been working on in humans, there's a thing called facial action coding system, where you basically, the danger when you read faces is that you interpret them. So you say you're smiling, or that's a false smile, or that's a false laugh, and whatever. And I know your smiles are genuine to me, Jim. But so what you do with facial action coding, this isn't going to work very well on the radio as he points to his face. I was listening to
he's pointing to his face.
So you basically, you imagine the face without any skin on it, and you think which muscles are contracting, and you describe it in relation to those muscle contractions. And it was originally developed in humans. A group in Portsmouth have very much developed it then across a wide range of species, primates. We asked them to develop one for cats as well, and there is one for dogs. And anyone can learn this. You can go online, you can learn the technique, and it just stops you from that sort of rushing in and interpreting, saying, oh, the dog is smiling, or the dog is snarling, his top lip is turned up. You actually describe what is going on. And we've used that in order to see which features are more common in certain emotions. Now, the key thing here, before anyone rushes out, is there is no one facial expression of frustration or fear. What you see is differences in the frequency. So actually, contrary to what a lot of people thought, when we looked at the fearful dogs, it was not the ears back. Ears going back actually occur in so many different situations. It's not very useful for telling you that the dog is scared. Actually, it was more about the jaw being and the dog and the tongue being out in the situation was much more informative. But it is a relative rate and duration. So you can't just look, and everybody wants to find that, that golden sign that says this is what this means. But actually reading dogs is about watching them over a prolonged period of time and saying, I'm seeing more of that. That is what's going on. And it is, it's a dynamic exchange.
Absolutely. And I agree. And we won't get too far off here, but in the work I do with training police officers to recognize the difference between a dog that's likely to hurt them and a dog that's not, whole different thing. But I try to teach them some very basic things, like the difference between a smiling dog and a dog that actually has the muscle contractions that's producing that agonistic pucker, that contraction of the upper lip up against the nose, where it's, instead of just simply showing teeth, which I don't know if you've dealt with them, but Chesapeake Bay retrievers love to smile.
Yeah.
But you don't see that part of the facial action. If a Chessie does contract those muscles, you're in trouble because it's about to bite you. And they're wonderful dogs, but I love them to death. But in any case, yeah, I can see that, and I think that that's something that we over time can look at. Before I don't mean to blow my own trumpet here, but before I started doing this, we didn't have any post-attack videos or records or evaluations that I'm aware of, at least not in North America.
I don't think anybody. I don't think anybody has been doing it. I mean,
I
first of all,
don't
you got
I
to
don't
capture
know
it.
if there may be somebody in Europe, one of the other contributors to the book, that's done some of this. Um,
Not post
but
attack. I don't think so.
I think, and that's one of the things that fascinates me is looking, and I like the word diagnosis, even though I'm not a vet. The idea of using post-attack behaviors and reactions to different stimuli to try and project what the behavior at the time of the incident was, and to see what the sensitivities were. I worked an attack down in Australia with the federal police. In fact, I was leaving Australia when they literally pulled me off the airplane to come back and said, "Get back to Canberra now. We're holding a scene for you." And the dog had killed its own owner, but investigation had revealed that this particular dog had protected the owner against two different violent attacks, and an unknown or unknown to the dog visitor came over, and the dog, again, I hate to say misinterpreted, but the dog saw or perceived that person somehow as a threat and went after them, and the owner attempted to restrain the dog and actually had the other person go hide in the laundry room. But the dog's state of arousal was so high that eventually the dog redirected, and that goes to your frustration. It redirected all of that focus and energy because the target of choice was missing, and the dog turned on the only target that was available. So I think looking at looking at these emotional states, and what happens when perhaps the dog's emotional state exceeds the natural control mechanisms that are present.
No, I think
two of those.
Yeah, no, I'm going to be fascinated to see sort of what comes out of your thesis in that regard. But so I think we probably ought to move on to something more jolly. So, are you working such a? What's it like being a policeman in the States? That's a jolly topic.
It's much different now than when I was out there. Things have changed since 1999 when I retired. I was fortunate I got hired as a mere baby and was able to retire in my 40s. So it's been a while. It's very challenging. And my youngest brother, my family's been involved in law enforcement in the United States pretty much every other generation since 1870, literally. And my baby brother retired from our main department, is now working for a police department at a university. And policing today is far different than it was a long time ago. And I'm not sure it's always that it's been totally in a good way.
I must admit, start again. Yeah, put my teeth in, start again. I realized as I was preparing that you're the only real policeman, US policeman or police that I know. And so my world of American police is built around Hollywood and TV dramas and whatever. And okay, that's TV dramas, but America does have a lot of guns. And if you stop somebody in a car, you don't know if they've got a gun. Whereas in the UK, you're pretty sure you can be pretty sure that they don't. I just don't know how somebody lives with that stress day in, day out. I mean, I know the police are coming in for a lot of slating at the moment in America, and there's bad apples in every barrel. But I mean, it must be incredibly stressful, surely. you know.
It is, and it's gotten worse. And you know, most of my career I spent working in high crime areas where we dealt with armed suspects on a daily basis, and we dealt with a lot of gun violence. And I actually find the British approach to be something that I wish I could infect the American policing with. Going back to, you know, the philosophical attitude that the police officer, and now we're, you know, with terrorism and everything else, we've got a whole different issue. But where the police officer is part of the village, and the good ones at least are there to support their community, to provide some order. But if the police officer typically says, excuse me, Clive, but you've had a bit too much at the pub and you need to go home now, the responses historically in the UK seem to be much different. Where here, the inebriated person is more likely to bow up and get violent with us, rather than
But when
again. I don't know. You know, I know a few officers in the UK, and I have dealt with them and talked with them, and the mindsets just, they don't mesh.
I think that the thing is, yeah, you know, it used to, you know, the police with the consent of the community, and they're there to help the community maintain law and order. Whereas now people say the police are the law and order, and they're there to make sure that you follow the law. And that is not, I think, a healthy attitude. You know, everybody's got to take responsibility. You can't expect the police to do it all. They're going to depend on everybody. But
see, I would like to see, for instance, and I think you have some of the resources and so forth in the UK. Right now, in this country, one of the big issues is police dealing with mentally ill people, using deadly force against the mentally ill. My feeling personally is, okay, great. As police, let's not answer any more of those calls, period. If you have a family member who's off their medications and is acting crazy, you pick up and call 918 instead of 919, and you get trained social workers and mental health professionals who can come help the patients in their area, who after a while they will get to know through their crisis. Nobody shows up with machine guns and explosives. Instead, we show up going, "Hi there, George," or, you know, in the old days, and I hate to put it that way, but when I was on the street as a patrolman, we rode particular beats and pretty much stayed there all the time. I knew my community members who were mentally challenged. They knew me. If I had one of them backed off threatening somebody, I could probably walk up and say, "Dalton, look, it's me, it's Jim. We need to calm this down. You're off your meds again, and we've talked about this. You know how you get when you're off your meds." And we would de-escalate the situation. And in a lot of cases, they'd go, "Oh yeah, but such and such, okay, we've talked about this before. Remember what we agreed to do last time? Last time you told me that when you were feeling this way, you'd give me a call and I would help you get to the doctor or to the hospital." "Oh yeah, I remember that." That's something that, whether it's resources or manpower, we don't do anymore.
Yeah.
And so I think that, for instance, we could take 99% of those conflicts off the table by providing access to mental health issues. And it's like when I talk with police officers and teach them, if they will simply reach out to their animal services officers when they're going someplace where they know there's animals, let them take care of the animals so you don't have to shoot them. Let the guy who catches obnoxious dogs all day long, every day, without a gun, let him go in. I mentioned I worked with the status dog unit there with the Met in London. And those guys, they cracked me up, because here we have the situation, oh, I was in such a situation and I got to escalate and do this, and then I blew up and we brought in the tank. And those guys were, well, you know, yesterday I went and there was an Alsatian that was being obnoxious, but I managed to safely get him on the pole and put him in the van. Oh, you weenie. Yesterday I went and there was a large Staffordshire Terrier that I just simply took a slip lead and a muzzle and got him in the truck. Oh, you weenie. Yesterday I had this giant Mastiff and I used a cookie and a shoestring and got the dog. And they literally, sitting around the office talking, they had this attitude is, who could take the biggest, nastiest dog with the least amount of force and the most finesse, if you will, and not have anything go wrong? And it's such a different mindset.
Yeah, I mean, well, yeah, I think there's a big cultural, and I know our NHS isn't perfect, but to me, you know, it's just so important. That when I took my sons to the States last couple of years, that's the first thing they picked up on was there seem to be so many people with mental health problems on the streets, and so, yep, that's and that's why they're there, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah,
they flushed our system. The government flushed all of our resources and dumped all those people on the street back in the late 70s, early 80s, and we've been reaping the lack of benefits of that ever since.
Anyway, we better keep talking about dogs rather than people with mental health problems. So, I usually talk to people about cats and horses as well, but I don't know that they're very much your forte. But
no, I like cats. They're nice. They're wonderful. Horses I've had to deal with in the animal control world because of the jobs I've had where we've investigated problems with them, but I don't know how to drive them. I'm really not sure how you start them, and the air conditioning doesn't work very well on them. So they're just not my thing.
So I was surprised that you weren't in the dog unit with the police, were you?
No, I wanted to, but things worked out where I just wasn't.
Because that was the other thing, which you're a member of the APDT, Association of Pet Dog Trainers, which are very much focused on positive reinforcement. That's not something that you'd immediately think of somebody who's retired from the police force. It's interesting. A few years ago, they had the national championships for the police with the dogs actually just down the road from where we were, and we happened to be passing with my boys, and there were two people in the sort of playoff for the final, and you could see one was trained with rewards and one wasn't. And I just sort of started giving a running commentary to the boys, and they immediately, they could start to see it and think, yeah, okay. Unfortunately, the dog that had been trained with the rewards just didn't do as good a recall in the final. And so the other one won. But, so there has been a lot of criticism of the police in the past with use of quite aversive methods. That's certainly in the UK, that's something that's changing. And
it is slightly here too.
So that was my question. What is the culture amongst the police there?
The culture is very ingrained for the old, harsh, aversive training methods. And in all fairness, if you've got a dog that is going to have to fight with a suspect that's resisting strongly, there are probably some less than kind things the dog has to be aware that it can work its way through. You don't want a dog that if the bad guy just punches it in the nose, it runs away and quits.
No,
but that said, there is a much growing movement in the US to less use of aversive techniques,
So
to less use of the, see, electronic collars are still legal here.
yeah, and they're widely
And
used.
they
I was surprised just how common they are in the States as
very
well.
common.
Because I was
And
chatting to
people
some of my
don't, yeah, people don't realize I just worked a bite case, and the bite by the dog happened at the boundary line for an invisible fence. Probably when the dog was being stimulated, the dog had been trained with the aversive techniques, and the poor civilian that happened to be there at the wrong time got nailed. And I suspect that the combination of generally aversive training and the electronic stimulus combined to trigger the dog to look for what was attacking it. And it did. And it nailed the person, the closest target.
So, have you seen the paper that we recently published on shock collars training?
I've seen a couple of them. I'm not sure if I've
So,
seen the latest one.
so we had one come out not so long ago, because the debate in this country is very much focused on the welfare of using shock collars and some of the issues in relation to that. And one of the problems when you do this sort of research, there's many challenges to doing the research, and is, as I said earlier, no single behavior is going to tell you that this is harmful or not, unless the dog drops down dead, which isn't going to happen. And that's a non-behavior then. One of the definitions of behavior is what living animals do and dead animals don't. That's about the best definition. But
it's kind of like drowning is called failing to swim.
Yeah. And so what we decided to do was we looked at the videotapes, and these were dogs that had been referred for chasing problems. And just so that people, and again, I'll put the link up on the website for people to read. It's open access, so anyone can read it. And whereas in the past we'd looked at their behavioral reactions and then said, well, overall, when you take the overall view, this is what we think is going on. And people say, well, that's very subjective. Well, science does involve a degree of subjectivity, because you choose to study some things and not others, for a start. But you can't just take one sign to make your case, especially when you're talking. And it's about trying to reduce the uncertainty. What we decided to do, and I'll give a name plug to the student, Lucy China, who did this for her master's, is we said, well, rather than focus on the welfare, let's just look at the issue of efficacy. Because under the law, it is an offence to cause unnecessary suffering. So that implies that, and one of the defences has been, well, you can't train an animal as effectively to do the recall when it's a livestock warrior, using rewards as you can with an e-collar. And, you can follow the logic, and somewhat remarkably, nobody had ever actually compared the two. So we set up the experiment, and we had a group of people who were put forward by the industry of the Electronic Collar Manufacturers Association. They were the trainers that they wanted to use. They used the e-collars on the dogs. They also used a condition where they didn't use the e-collars as well, because they said, well, we wouldn't always use it. And we said, well, okay, we'll take another group and do that. And then we had a third group, which was a group of people who were members of the APDT, Association of Pet Dog Trainers, who are very much focused on the use of delivery of positive reinforcement and not using physical punishment. And the really neat thing that came out of it, and there are issues because they were done at different times of year, etc., but we just found no evidence that the electronic collars were even as were better than the use of the rewards. And that's the key thing. And if there was a difference between the two, it was always in favor of the delivery of the food rewards. So even if you set aside the argument on welfare, and as I said, we can argue that the toss over it, I couldn't believe that some of the collars, they work over 2 miles. I'm thinking, how can you know what's going on 2 miles away with your dog? But anyway.
And in full disclosure, when I first started training dogs, I actually used e-collars in field work. And then over time, I was very fortunate that I don't know if you've dealt with them, but curly-coated retrievers are very soft personalities. And in the United States, in the field trial world, there's a very heavy use of very heavy levels of correction, because typical field trial lines of black Labrador retrievers respond to a pretty standard training program to do those long straight lines and fast retrieves. And because I was working with a breed that isn't wired quite the same way, I had to learn other ways. And so I got more and more over time away from using those. And I don't even own one anymore and have not used one in years. But even when I did use them, what I tended to use was the audible signal as a clicker at 500 yards. So I blew my whistle, the dog plopped his butt down at 500 yards and looked at me, and I could push my button and go, "Good boy," because it beeped at him. There was no shock.
Yeah.
But that's a very good thing, is that if the dog is out 2 miles, you've got no business using an aversive method, because you can't see what they're doing. What if the dog, the dog's 2 miles, you communicate a recall, and the dog's running for you full bore, but he's 1.5 miles away and you can't see him, and you sit there and you lean on the collar. Now you're counter training and confusing the whole problem.
I found it mind-boggling to think, why would anybody want to do it? But there's people who think it's.
I never figured it out.
But anyway, so as I said, the neat thing was that we found that everything seemed to be stacked, and so this argument that, oh well, you can't train. Well, yes, you can if you're a good trainer of positive reinforcement, and if you can't train with rewards, the recall of the dog that is, chasing wildlife or chasing sheep and whatever, then refer the case on to somebody who can. Just admit, there are certain things I can't do, and if I want to achieve them, I'll ask somebody else to do it.
Well, do you recall what Ian's advice on collars has been in the past?
No, we didn't chat about that.
Years ago, we talked about it. I was at one of his seminars, and his response was, okay, if you're going to use an electronic collar, you have to have a deep understanding of dogs' behavior. You have to be able to understand and read their actions and know what's going on with the dog. And you have to have impeccable timing. And in which case, you don't need an e-collar.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no,
you have the skills, and the collar is irrelevant. You don't need it.
Yeah.
And that's the only, but unless you have all of those, you shouldn't be using it in the first place. So,
yeah, no, I think that's very true. So moving on, because I'm conscious of time, because this always happens that we get chatting and time goes by. In the introduction, we started to talk about fake dogs. And actually, one of the things that triggered me contacting you was one of my postdocs getting in touch with you after she heard you speak. And you suddenly said, oh, hang on, you're 12 months late with a response to my email about something else. But anyway, so you did a presentation at the Animal Behavior Society meeting a month or two ago.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't hear it, so I don't know what you said, but it did, from what I heard, it sounded like you got some similar ideas. But this is one of the things that, again, sort of people talk about. So let's talk a little bit about that, if you don't mind. So, when you should or shouldn't, if ever, use real dogs, fake dogs, what your experience is. And the thing about these chats is, as I said, I think of them like sort of after the conference barroom chats. We're talking about things where there really isn't much research, and so it is going to be one person's opinion. You and I might have differences in opinion, but in a nutshell, what did you say at the ABS meeting that got Holly so excited?
What I brought up was a very specific case. It was 21 bona fide documented fighting dogs from Southern Ontario that were seized in an arrest. And these are dogs that not only had scarring, They had fight records. These were honest to God fighting pit bulls. So they had been evaluated by another group that had said all 21 of these dogs needed to be killed because they were too dangerous to be released into the community. The single, now they did evaluate a few others that, and in fairness, that they said, okay, these dogs can be worked with, but the 21 were all to be killed. And another group got involved and got the court to finally allow me to come up and spend 3 weeks in Southern Ontario working with these dogs to develop an opinion. The through line for all of the failures and all of the decisions to kill these dogs was that every one of them reacted violently to the fake dog. They all went after the dog, fake dog. When I went up there and evaluated, there were 2 dogs that I said, okay, these dogs, and they were bona fidely humanly dangerous. One I couldn't even get out of the kennel, and the previous evaluation team, that dog had bitten one of their people 9 times. So that dog was nuts. The other dog had some very clear sensitivities and had disproportionate violent reactions. I was able to handle the dog to a limited extent and did not get bitten, but he was very iffy. So both of those I refused. But out of the rest of them, we managed to do a hands-on evaluation with each and every one of them. And based on my recommendation, those other dogs were allowed by the court to be transferred from the OSPCA here to Florida to a couple of trainers that I work with. One center out in further out in North Florida, some were local. And out of those dogs that in my evaluation where I did not use the fake dog, or in one case they had failed it because of the fake child, out of those dogs, there was one that was put down for behavior. There was one that died of medical. However, almost 66% of them were able to be placed in homes where they still are. 4 of them are working as law enforcement detector dogs. 2 of them are actual bona fide service dogs. And that was because my evaluation, I went in, I didn't use the fake dog or the fake kid, and instead looked at where they had sensitivities and where they had deficits and helped put together a training program to address those problems. And so when it boiled down, the actual false positive of using rate of using the fake dog was about 80%. About 80% of the dogs that they had said absolutely positively were too dangerous because of that wound up being fine. I suspect, and I'm not sure what you've seen, I think this is something worth looking into, is both with the fake dog and the fake child. We mentioned and we discussed earlier how quickly dogs signal back and forth. If you think about a fake dog, sure, it looks like a dog, but it's stiff. It doesn't move. There is no signaling. There's no motion. You have a stiff dog with ears and face that do not vary, with staring eyes, and all of these characteristics that at best are confusing to the signaling abilities of the other dogs. And I'd actually like to see a study where we could be videotaping, or we don't tape anymore, but recording the dogs that react to them, that are reacting to fake dogs. And I suspect that it's probably within fractions of a second of them first perceiving the fake dog that they're going to begin showing you those micro expressions and showing you the confusion signals, and will have gone through 4 or 5 sets of signaling, and the other dog is not responding. And I'm curious as to what the threshold of time is. And again, I suspect it may be as little as microseconds before the dog realizes there's something wrong with this thing that looks like a dog. It's like the life-size child some people use. Here you have cute little Susie that typically has huge, big, staring eyes and a grin on her face, and very often teeth showing. And she's stiff and she's sticking her arms out to her side, and they're hopping her towards a dog like no child ever moves. And so what do I think the dog sees? They see some weird thing that's sort of human shaped, doesn't smell right, doesn't move right, is maybe giving warning or threatening behavior. And this is something that at best, I should probably get behind my handler and wait till it goes away. But then they're gonna chase me around the room with it and see what happens. Well, you chase them long enough, the dog is gonna react.
Yeah. No, so we've, I mean, we do have stuffies in our clinic, and I've always, we tend to use them if we are concerned, and we just want to get a dog's initial reaction. And I think that if you have a stuffy, you know, you may get no response at all.
Mm-hmm.
You may get a response, in the first second or two, rarely more than that, that tells you how the dog is going to respond to the dog. And then it just realizes it's something else. And that's just with the stationary dog. Interestingly, a number of years ago, I had this conversation with guide dogs in the UK because they had an issue with their dogs being attacked.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, it's easy to stigmatize people. But I just said to them, look, one of the issues, I think, and I fully appreciate that, you know, if you're blind, you don't want your dog running off to go and sort out the issue. But the dog should be able to signal to the blind person that, hang on, there's an issue here that I need to sort out, because the way they train their dogs is to completely blank other dogs.
Right.
Now, you know, if I'm having a conversation with you and you start blanking me, then okay, this podcast isn't going to last very long, and I'll be a little bit peeved at the end of it. You know, so, you know, what's it like for a dog? They're there signaling, and the dog in the harness just completely blanks them and gives them no signals. That is really weird. You know, we were talking about mental health earlier on. You know, you see people.
That's a great point.
You think, whoa, what's going on? So how does the dog respond? Well, it becomes frustrated and it becomes more intense and more aroused. What the hell is going on here? And it tries to get the response, and ultimately that could result in an attack. So I do think that, you know, what I really wanted them to do, and I don't think they took it on board, was, you know, you have to train the dog, that the guide dog, that here is a situation, I need you to just step back as the blind person while and I don't mean let go of the lead or anything like that, but, you know, I've got an issue here. I need you to, you know,
get out of my way long enough where I can send a signal that I don't want to engage.
Yeah, and we can calm the situation down, because me standing here or walking and completely blanking is actually only going to escalate things. So, you know, yeah, and I think the same goes. And we did a study many years ago, actually. The student was Carly Tempany, and I still see her occasionally on Facebook and what have you, and she came up to one of my talks, and she did a study where she used the assessor hand, you know, the Sue Sternberg. And what she did is she put a long coat on, put the assessor hand down, and we basically gave dogs treats with real hands or with the assessor hand. And we looked. Well, the first thing was, I think it was all dogs that were less than a year old had to be excluded from the analysis because they just played with it like a toy.
Mm-hmm. And I agree with you on the assessor hand, because even though they're, as you well know, there are issues with seeing food guarding and behavior in a shelter situation versus whether that's predictive outside the shelter situation. If I have to check, number one, if I'm looking for sensitivities, unlike some others, I don't need to precipitate a bite to see where there's a problem.
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
dramatic for TV. Yeah. But if I need to actually tell somebody, okay, I've actually tested this, I put on a Kevlar glove, and if I don't see the warning signals, I stick my physical hand in the bowl with the dog, with the food, because my dogs know the difference between my hand and a piece of plastic on a
Well,
stick.
dog, and this is what we were saying earlier again, dogs are incredibly perceptive. They live in a completely different, I think, time. They can process, because their brains aren't cluttered up with all the abstract thinking that we do. They can process things so much faster. That's, why they, I think they can respond. So, we've got the advantage of being able to think about things in a complicated way, but that actually makes us quite slow to make decisions on a lot of these things. Whereas dogs, boom, by the time we've started to think, what do I think about this? The dog has already made 27 decisions about it. So yeah, so there's that situation. And then what the interesting thing that she found was that the dogs that had been rescued off the street, I think, compared to the pet dogs from breeders, etc., never sort of been on the street, were more likely to approach than the than the pet dogs, which initially we thought was strange, because you think, well, they'd be more nervous, but no, they've had to scavenge. So if there's food, they go for it. It's as simple as that.
Mm-hmm.
And again, and one of my colleagues did a study again with a stuffy, and we walked dogs round a corner, and they suddenly saw the stuffy, and again, it's just versus a real dog. And yeah, you've got maybe a few fractions of a second, but I think if you've got to look at what is going on, and what is the purpose of the test. It's not diagnostic in its own sense. It's a question of, what do I do next? Have I learned enough to be able to decide? And this is it. People want these simple formulae. What do I do in order to work out if a dog is dangerous? Oh, if he attacks the stuffy, he's off the list. Boom. I can fill in the paperwork. Boom, job is done. And it's not surprising people get bored with their jobs if that's all they do. If that's all they want as well. I mean, every dog is unique, and it's much more interesting to see them that way, and to do something sort of and think, okay, what has that just told me?
Yeah, the population of dogs, and I've been very open about that. The population of dogs that I actually did this with was a very highly selected population, not by me, but by natural circumstances. These were bona fide fighting dogs who had been trained to fight, who had physically fought, who had been there. They were, most of them were related fairly closely. So it was a isolated population. So I don't think we should jump to saying, okay, the fake dog test is bogus for everybody.
No.
This was a very limited population. But for instance, if I want to see dog-dog reactivity, for instance, I'm interested as to whether a dog reacts to another dog, but I'm more interested to know whether the reactive animal can be redirected to an alternate set of behaviors, and at what intensity of reaction can I still interrupt? Can I interrupt at 50 meters from another dog or 5 meters from another dog? And what is the reaction to the recovery? And can I use that to keep the dog sub-reaction in its arousal level to teach a competing behavior that we can live with? And that's the overall approach we took with these fighting dogs, is intervene at first recognition of another dog at a distance, and then slowly work to basically make the competing behavior a calm sit, or at least ignoring the other dog, pay off much more for them than the actions that had been previously taught by whatever means, probably aversive, that they had been taught to fight before.
Yeah. No, and let's say, and I'm sure, yeah, you deal with a completely different population to me. As I've got older, I
Mhm.
mean, you've got older, you've gone to work with the dangerous dog. As I've got older, I've gone to work with assistance animals. I like working more and more in that field because
It's a
they
lot
don't want to
safer.
hurt me. Yeah, I'm getting old. Uh, I think I am becoming more jumpy actually as I get older. Um, but we a few years ago we did have a case that it was a pointer in the clinic, and it'd been attacking other dogs, and we used a stuffy, and it was quite interesting because that is one of the very few cases where the dog's reaction and the owner said, "Yeah, that's what it seemed. That's what happened in the attack." You know,
Mhm.
a couple of occasions, it just launched straight at the other dog, went for the neck, pinned down. You know, the stuffy. And there wasn't time for it to realize it was a stuffy. Yeah, I don't think I'll be using a stooge dog on this one. I think I've learned enough. That is it though. It's about, it's horses for courses. You might want to use it, but you don't use it unthinkingly. Too often people, and again, oh look, the dog has attacked the stuffy. No, the dog is playing with the stuffy. Please make sure you know the difference between a dog that is trying to eat and a dog that's trying to play.
Yeah,
And
and the dog
not
is
a
trying to
superficial.
dissect. The dog may think that the stuffy is actually a squeaky toy and is trying to dissect the squeaker out of it, like it's done for all of its stuffed toys all of its life.
Yeah,
You
no,
know, do
yeah,
we
no,
have that going on?
yeah, no. I think so. I think we're on the same. On the same page for that.
I'm cautious about it. I think we really need to, if possible, not only continue to watch it closely, but also watch the timing where the reactive dogs go from, oh, that's a dog-shaped object, to I'm starting to get confused, or I'm starting to get frustrated, or I'm feeling threatened. And then look at it in the pet population, and then also look at it in those populations where the dogs have been, even if they're not formal fighting dogs, where you've got um, the, the fellow going down the street in Manchester, and I'll pick on them, that encourages his dog to bark at other dogs and thinks it's funny when the dog threatens other people.
Yeah. So I mean, there certainly are dogs. Even if you just put a silhouette on the wall, they will go up to the bum end of the silhouette and
Mm-hmm.
sniff it, and that certainly happens. And they will use very simple stimuli. We did an experiment a few years ago, actually. Again, one of our master students. We did publish it. Biological motion, where you put. So if you see dots moving on a screen, in a certain way, even though these dots are not connected, you'll look at it and say that's a person walking across the screen.
Oh, yeah.
You put reflectors in effect on their elbows,
Right.
their shoulders, and their wrists, etc., and the way they move. And we decided to look at whether or not dogs were subject to biological motion. And so you can have the dots random, or you can have the inverted image. So rather than, in effect,
Mm-hmm.
the person walking on the ground, they're walking on the ceiling, and they look at it in a different way. And cut a long story short, the dogs did respond to the biological motion, and they also responded to biological motion of other dogs. But what was interesting is when we looked at the dog's sociability, and we just used a simple way of assessing, the dog's history and its reactivity to other dogs, the dogs that were more reactive to other dogs sort of distinguished the biological, spent more time looking at the dots of that represented a dog walking either across their visual field or towards them. Whereas dogs that were more sociable only really paid attention to the dots that looked as if a dog was walking towards you. And it just struck me, well, yeah, maybe, obviously if you see something coming towards you, you pay more attention to it. That makes sense. Why were the more reactive dogs? Well, because they probably didn't know it wasn't significant. They still saw the biological motion. And I suspect that the sociable dogs still saw the biological motion, but they just ignored it because things going across your field are not coming to interact with you.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the more reactive dogs just couldn't switch off. And we don't know whether they were more anxious and therefore they were more sensitive, or whether because they were more sensitive, they're going to get worn down and therefore they get more stress. We don't know which comes first, but it was a neat little study.
And
But
did they maybe did the reactive dogs, were they more likely to or have a lower threshold of perceiving a potential threat?
Well, all we know is that they were more likely to show forms of aggression or aggressive behaviors, so
Mm-hmm.
the bark or whatever at other dogs and things like that. But it was a neat thing. We ought to follow it up. But I said there's only been a couple of studies that have looked at biological motion in dogs, and they said that was the one, and it was the aspect of the personality that came through. But it just
Mm-hmm.
shows, our behavior is controlled by really, simple subliminal cues, and the same goes with humans as well. We like to think we're really sophisticated, but actually, our brain is busy looking for the obvious rules in order to work out what's going on. But anyway, so let's talk about something else, because I'm conscious of time, and time is running on. Because I noticed, because one of the things you sent me about was that you had been involved in a thing called No More Homeless Pets and prison-based dog training programs,
Mm-hmm.
which I've had a little bit. Well, not. No, I've given the odd talk here and there for some of these things. I really like these prison-based programs, and I'm the first to admit that I have been so lucky. I might want to, I can complain about certain things, but I have had lots of breaks in life. I was brought up in a safe neighborhood, and I had the opportunities. And you hear the backstory of some of these kids, and you just think, I don't think I would have turned out as well as they have, if I'd been in their environment. But one of the things that somebody was telling me about, one of the things about these programs is that actually, I don't know if I want to give you a chance to talk about it, really, I guess, but hey, I'm on a roll. Somebody was telling me they use rescue dogs, and one of the things they thought that happened was actually giving them rescue dogs to work with had an extra benefit, in so much as they could identify with the dog, that here was something that had been abandoned, they felt they'd been abandoned, and that added an extra dimension. And I can't remember who it was who told me about that. Maybe it was you. I don't know. But
That's something we've
it's
seen.
a really neat. I just think it's a really neat additional thing, because a lot of the problems for people in these situations is kids have problems with communication. So if they learn to train a dog, then they learn communication, they learn self-control, patience as well. But this other factor, that they also engage with another life that has been tossed on the garbage.
I found the whole thing very, very valuable to myself also, because in all honesty, in all the years as a police officer, I looked at inmates as simply, yes, I know they're people and they've had good and bad backgrounds, but they were just a category of human being that was stuck to the side. I didn't pick on them or dislike them, or they were just, I just never thought about it. When we started the program, and as we went through the program, I was dealing with these people in prison on a completely different basis. And the first thing I had to do to be able to connect with them, and the dogs actually helped with that, was to be able to look at them as something other than inmate number 44776. But that these were people that had backstories and how all that contributed in. And the value with using the rescue dogs is we were able to take animals that had that had mixed backgrounds or unknown backgrounds, that had wound up being dependent on others for whatever reason. And some of those dogs had made good choices, and some of them had made less good choices. And in talking with the inmates over time, they were able to explain to me that, for instance, those who were in one of our facilities that were doing life in prison, These guys were in for violent crimes. Excuse me, I'm sorry. These guys were in for violent crimes. They were older gentlemen. They had been in prison for 10 to 20 years already, and were going to spend the rest of their lives. And they explained to me, and this was not just in a group, this was individuals at times, that they knew their life had limited value as far as the outside world went because they were never going to be there. But after all of the years in prison, they found that they had a desire to somehow change something positively and have an effect on some other creature. And by working with the dogs and making them and helping make them from dogs that were typically very likely to be destroyed at the local shelter because they were just another pit mix type or just another mutt. They were actually able to help these dogs overcome some of their past, especially when we had fearful dogs, to overcome reaction to specific people or groups of people, to be able to help these dogs become sociable. The fact that the dogs were, once they had the opportunity, were very willing to accept the person just the way they were in the moment and not prejudge them. And that they learned that they could help change the dog's behavior so that dog did not lose its life or did not wind up in prison for the rest of its life. It had profound effects both ways. It helped those dogs become much more adoptable. We had a huge adoption rate from the program, but it also, the men felt like, and we were just dealing with males. We didn't have the ability to go into the woman's prison, but with the men, we were able to give them a feeling and that they were finally able to contribute to something other than themselves by doing something more than just making license plates or something. And that they were able to, even after a lifetime of bad choices and doing some pretty horrible things, that they were able to give another creature a foot up and let them not make those choices. And one of the things we found was in the shorter term, and a friend, I don't know if she's finished it or not, but a friend was looking at our program longitudinally. The effects of the dogs on the inmates were that those inmates that were shorter term and were getting out wound up so far have been more successful in the outside world being involved in the dog training program than the baseline inmates that were just, in normal confinement. And in fact, we've had several of inmates who were with our program for, more than just a few months, a couple of years, that were able to come out and actually use their training experience to get bona fide jobs in the animal world and to take the skills and the confidence and the empathy that they learned from working with dogs and to transfer that to their own families, to the people around them, to make better choices. So it's been a very interesting experience dealing with both the humans and the dogs. It's great that we can save dogs and get them adopted, but there were some pretty profound effects on the inmates who learned, they can't get mad and just yell at the dog. They can't lose control of their emotions. They're responsible for that dog. We had dogs assigned to teams of 2 or 3 inmates. One was the primary trainer, and then one was the basically assistant, so that if one person had to go to a doctor's appointment or a court appearance, the dog still had one of its 2 primary caretakers there all the time. And the discussions, you know, away from the stages and everything else, the discussions in private with some of these guys, it was really profoundly moving to hear and how the dogs had made a difference. And they had nothing to gain by discussing that with me or the other trainer we had involved. In fact, they knew I was an old cop, so there was probably, you know, a reason for them to distrust me. But, you know, this was not sitting before the parole board telling them that you found God and you've decided to help small children and little kittens across the world. These were guys who were actually talking about their real day-to-day lives.
So just out of interest, just listening to that just made me think, do you think that the prison guards looking after them also saw them differently after they saw what these people were like with the dog, or
Yes.
not?
Yes. In fact, the prison, we had prison guards that were assigned to the program specifically, and we had run them through the basic manual of training that we wanted the inmates to be following. And so they were involved in the process. And those dorms or housing areas where we had the dog programs, they had fewer disciplinary problems. They had fewer fights. The permanent correctional officers, guards that were in those situations had better relationships, not being necessarily all fuzzy wuzzy love each other, but more constructive relationships with the inmates. The inmates felt more positive about the staff there. And when we did have problems with guards, they were typically somebody that had had to fill in from somewhere else because our normal officer was out sick, and you know, they were just stuck there for the day and didn't have the background. And you could tell the atmospheric difference between the guards who were part of the program and had a relationship with the dogs and the inmates versus those who were just filling in and doing time. And you froze. There you are. There you are.
Yeah, I was going to say, we just broke up for just a few seconds there. So
yeah, you froze for a second. So.
Yeah, now it might be I've got a thing just flashed up saying my internet is unstable. I hope nobody in the family is using it up. Hopefully the recording will work at your end. I will double check. That's exactly why we asked you to record it as well, because that was if I missed the very end of it, but I will listen for it in any case. But
I was saying that the times we had problems with guards was typically guards that were filling in, and not the ones that had relationships with the inmates and with the dogs. And even the guards, you know, in talking with us privately, said that this changed in some ways, at least for some of them, their outlook on the inmates and their place in the grand scheme of things.
Okay. I'm conscious of time. So we haven't really talked that much about your PhD, which is fascinating. It's based at Florida on, so maybe we can just finish off by, you can tell me a little bit, if you're happy to tell me a little bit more about what you're up to with your PhD. Exactly.
I'll try to rein it in. My master's thesis I did on the uses of evidence and procedures on investigating serious and fatal dog attacks, and was intended as basically looking at the differences between evidence in a normal homicide, if you will, Joe stabbed Bobby at the corner, versus a homicide involving a dog. And there are obviously different evidentiary needs. We're talking about bite marks, we're talking about behavior, we're talking about the actions of a sentient choice-making weapon, if you will. So there's a lot of different stuff. And with this now, for my PhD, I'm proceeding beyond that, still looking at the same cases, but in looking at, for my master's thesis, and having the ability, which, my wife says I need to clone myself, but having the records and the experience and so forth of dealing with as many attacks as I have, and the hard evidence and stuff that doesn't wind up in the media cases and stuff that maybe isn't even released from the court appearances because it's sensitive or whatever. Looking at the injury patterns and looking at the bite evidence and the later assessments of the dogs to look for more commonalities, because my feeling is that the more we learn about these worst case scenarios, the more we're going to be able to, there are a zillion dog bite prevention programs out there, and they all say basically the same thing. But I think we have an opportunity to understand what the difference is as those go up the scale and as the severity of the incidents increases, and looking at, I believe I've got at least a clue that we should be able to look at the physical parameters of bites, being, the number of bites, the intensity of the bites, the locations of the bites, the physical aspects of the bites, the pressure involved, and by depth, and be able to make, hopefully make some association between the dogs involved in those versus the dogs that acted differently and chose other means, and whether there is an emotional difference between them. What makes sense, if we can tell that to the dog, as to why the dog would rip your arm off at the elbow versus simply bite you in the butt as you ran away. To look at that stuff and to be able to really dig into the circumstances of the bites. And part of what I look at is, when I can interview people, when there are witnesses, if you, even in a regular dog bite, if you ask someone what was going on, and they go, nothing, the dog just bit. Okay, let's stop that. Let's go, what were you doing the day before? What were you doing that morning? What were you doing an hour, and what was the dog doing an hour before? What were you doing 30 minutes, 3 minutes, 30 seconds? And let's see if we can look at the precursor behaviors. One case I had, the dogs had spent all day in a backyard, tethered out and tied, but the family had been out all day. Yes, the adults had been drinking, the kids had been running around, and they had been driving these little motorized four-wheel motorcycle things, the four-wheelers. I'm sure you have them in the UK, around in circles all day long for hours. And finally, everybody got tired, and they put the stuff up, and they went inside, and the little girl decided to go back outside and jump up and down on the trampoline. And after that entire day of intense arousal, that was the last straw, and all three dogs broke loose of their tethers and attacked the girl. Well, if we had just done the regular investigative thing and be like, we don't know what happened. She went out there, the dogs just lost it and went off.
Yeah.
They just snapped. Well, no, they didn't snap. There was hours of buildup. to
Yeah.
this.
So
And
that's,
so what I'm looking at now is trying to look at more of the profiles of these attacks, the detailed information, and see if we can't. Like I said, I'm looking at the difference between accidental death, the two we mentioned, an offensive aggressive response, a defensive aggressive response, a redirected response, such as I mentioned with the poor woman in Australia, where the dog's focus was on one thing, but the frustration level was so high that the dog changed targets because that dog emotionally at that time had to do something to reduce the level of arousal that it was under. So I think that there was very definitely an emotional component there where the dog was just so, wow, it just had to do something.
so that's one of the things we talked earlier about the diagnosis, and we talked about context, motivation, and emotion. And then the other thing we lay on top of that are what we call moderators of response. So that's both the mood aspects. So yeah, the dog's got chronic pain, so it was in a bad mood, it just come back from a walk or something like that. And then the other sort of level of moderator is temperament, which is sort of, those individual differences which can shape the predispositions. That's why that dog did it, but not the other dog. But mood is something we really do lack decent research on, even in humans. I mean, when I was when I did the Encyclopedia of Animal Welfare, and I was editing that, and just trying to look up sort of, mood. And I've got a colleague who does work on cognitive bias and those sorts of ways of measuring mood in animals. But it's so poorly defined. I mean, there is no consensus on definitions of emotion. And as I said, mood itself as well, exactly what triggers it. When do we shift from one mood to another? We can understand, we can offer functional definitions of mood, why you would be in a good mood sometimes and not others. But it's absolutely fascinating. And I'm looking forward to reading your thesis.
Yeah, and
when did you
one
finish?
Of the things that we're kind of that I'm kind of looking at also is, and it may not be actually part of this, and maybe work down the road, but what can we safely glean from post-attack behavior, both immediately after the attack and 3 days or 24 hours later whenever I get a hold of the dogs, or if it's 6 months down the road because of delays or something. What can that tell us about the reasons for the attack, the emotional state of the animal? Is this a dog that the attack passed and just, as some do, just went and after it was all over and done with, they went over and laid down in the corner and took a nap? Sometimes the dogs will, after the attacks, go off and continue to be offensively aggressive towards first responders or family members. What leads up to this stuff, and then how can we use this information? Even here in the US, we have about 30 to 35 typically fatal attacks in the course of a year. In the UK, you guys have about 5 or 6 on a bad year.
Yeah.
So in Canada, they have 2 or 3. The Aussies have 1 or 2 or 3 a year. So population-wise, it's not that different. But if we can reduce it in the US from 35 to 25, or in the UK from 5 to 3, that doesn't sound, it's still a very small population that's involved. I mean, here I figured the numbers are, you have about 1 in 15 million chance of being killed by a dog. But for the families of those 3 or 5 or 10 people, the difference is tremendous.
Yeah. No. just because you've got a rare disease doesn't mean you want to hear that there's no treatment for it.
No,
You know, I mean, it's you do what you can. So when are you due to finish your PhD?
I'm hoping to have it finished by late spring or summer of next year.
Oh wow.
Um, I've done all the coursework, and the coursework has been fascinating because, unlike you, who's been to vet school, I had to back up and learn an awful lot of veterinary medicine to be able to learn how to appreciate it forensically.
Mm.
And I joke with people that if you have a dog and bring it to me, I can tell you why it's broken and what happened to it and help you process and collect whatever's necessary, but don't expect me to fix it, because when I get done, it's not going to work anymore. You know, I kind of view what I do more on the lines of, you know, sort of a medical examiner in some cases, be it physically or behaviorally, than as you as a veterinary physician that's actually fixing animals and putting them back together. But I've had to take coursework in forensic veterinary medicine and multiple forensic pathology courses and osteology and forensic behavior analysis. And so I've got all that behind me. So it's now I've got the big D hanging in front of me, the dissertation.
Yeah.
And you know, again, fortunately, I'm very lucky that I've got 15 years worth of data that I personally put together. Plus, I have some friends that have shared. For instance, Dr. Lockwood has shared files of his from old cases because he's pretty much retired, on the way to retiring. And with the other dog bite cases, especially where there's legal action, you know, I'm fortunate to have some really detailed information, data, documentation that isn't generally available. So I'm trying to use that in the most constructive way I can.
Mm-hmm. I'm looking forward to it. I really am. I'm sure there'll be a book that comes with it as well. But
I hope there will be one.
Anyway, thank you so much for me, a fascinating evening. For you, I don't know what you've made of the afternoon, but as always, it's been such a pleasure to chat with you, and I hope we catch up again soon. That's one of the other things about these podcasts, is it's about reconnecting with people. I think I started them, as I said to others, that during the COVID lockdown, I missed just having chats with people in my field, and it's just nice to pick up. And so I might be calling you anyway, just out of the blue, but I won't be hitting the record button necessarily next time.
Oh, I hope we do continue to stay in contact and chat. And you know, I as part of what I'm doing, I'd really like to look at you know, if we can do it, we'll look at profiles of attacks that have happened in the UK. And so maybe making a field trip over to Lincoln and connecting with whoever we possibly can that would be willing to share data at a level that they feel comfortable with.
Yeah.
And look at those, because I'd like to see if there's a difference in attacks that happen within the U.S. versus the UK versus Canada versus Australia. I can tell you that, for instance, in Canada, the most common breed that actually seriously injures or kills people are the sled dogs, not the target dogs we think of. Yeah. And that's because of the way that I believe it's because of the way they're kept, the temperament that the sled dog, especially the competitive ones, the people will put up with a much sharper, much more aggressive temperament if the dog is a good puller. They're much more, with their dogs like that, they're much more tolerant of human focused aggression and fights within their sled team. So I want to look at differences and similarities across those populations.
Hmm. Well, I'm sure they're there, yeah, and it's fascinating, and yeah, it raises a whole other area of questions about the cultural differences and the impacts they can have on the dogs. So
I figure that the you know UK, Canada, America, and Australia are similar enough that we may be able to get some good
mm,
information as opposed to looking what's happening in outer Mongolia.
yeah, well, you're certainly welcome to Lincoln anytime. My my youngest is well, he's on a gap year now. Then he'll be away at university, so we've got spare room in the house. Be good to see you. It's been lovely to see you again. You take care. And as I said, we'll be in touch soon. And as I said,
Okay.
hopefully one of either yours or my recording will have worked on this time. So thanks a lot.
I'm going to hit stop recording.
Yep, you hit that, and then it's all over. So thank you once again.
Let me know if you're missing anything, and or if you want, I can just simply upload it to Dropbox, and you can get it that way.
That's brilliant. Thanks a lot. And
all right.
take
Thanks,
care now.